The raw, unforgiving dust of the Arizona Territory was a thief. It had stolen the green from the landscape, the water from the earth, and the youth from Penelope Jenkins' face. Now it was coming for her husband, Thomas. The doctor from Tucson had been blunt, his words a hammer blow shattering the fragile life they had built. Consumption, a death sentence delivered on horseback. It would leave her a widow with a newborn daughter, Lily, and a small, isolated ranch teetering on the edge of Apache land. But survival in the West is a current that pulls its victims into the most unexpected of eddies. The very day she shoveled the last mound of dry earth over Thomas's grave, a wounded Apache warrior, bleeding and near death, collapsed at her doorstep. And strapped to his back, wailing with the fury of a starving hawk, was his own infant son. In an act of desperate compassion that would defy every warning she'd ever heard, every fear ingrained in her soul. Penelope made a choice that would bind her to a man sworn to be her enemy, and force her to answer to a name she could never have imagined mother. The silence was the worst part. For 5 years, the small adobe ranch house had been filled with the sounds of Thomas. The heavy thud of his boots on the wooden floorboards, the off-key tune he'd whistle while mending a harness, the low, steady murmur of his voice as he read to her from a tattered copy of Shakespeare by the firelight. He was a man who believed in filling the quiet, as if silence were a void that might swallow a man whole if left untended. Now the silence was absolute, broken only by the thin, reedy cries of their daughter Lily, and the lonely moan of the wind as it scoured the landscape around their homestead near the San Pedro River. Penelope Jenkins stood at the single window, looking out at the Dragoon Mountains, their jagged peaks tearing at the bruised purple of the twilight sky. They looked like teeth. Everything in this land looked like it had teeth. The cholla cactus, the rattlesnakes, the sun itself. She was 24 years old, but felt ancient, worn smooth as a river stone by grief. Thomas had been her anchor, a man of gentle strength and unwavering optimism. He saw not a desert, but a garden waiting for water. He saw not isolation, but sovereignty. "We're building a future here, Penelope girl," he'd say, his hand covering hers, his calluses a familiar comfort. "For us. For the ones who come after." The one who came after was now asleep in a cradle he had carved himself, a tiny, perfect thing with a tuft of blonde hair and her father's clear blue eyes. Lily. She was 3 weeks old. Thomas had held her only a handful of times before the coughing fits became too violent, before the blood on his handkerchief became too bright to ignore. Consumption, they called it. The wasting sickness. It had wasted him away until he was a stranger in their bed, a skeleton draped in skin, his once powerful chest a hollow cavern. Dr. Adams had made the long ride from Tucson, his face grim. He had offered morphine for the pain and condolences for the inevitable. He'd left 2 days ago. Thomas had died yesterday. Penelope had buried him herself this morning. She'd wrapped him in their best quilt, the one her mother had made as a wedding gift. She dug the grave on the small rise overlooking the cottonwood trees that marked their well, the only reliable water for 10 miles. The ground was hard, a stubborn crust of baked clay and rock that fought her with every plunge of the shovel. Her hands were raw, blistered, and bleeding, but she hadn't stopped. Each scrape of metal against stone was a penance, each shovelful of dirt a final terrible goodbye. When it was done, she had fashioned a cross from 2 pieces of scrap lumber and etched his name into the wood with the tip of a hot branding iron. Thomas Jenkins. Born 1850. Died 1878. A good man. Now back in the suffocating quiet of the house, the reality of her situation settled upon her like a shroud. She was alone. A woman with a newborn, a handful of cattle, a small cornfield, and a well that was the envy of men, far more ruthless than her husband had ever been. Men like Baron Croft, whose sprawling ranch bordered theirs to the north, and who had made no secret of his desire for their water. Thomas had always handled Croft, meeting his blustering threats with calm resolve. Penelope possessed no such confidence. And then there were the others. The Chiricahua Apache. Thomas had believed in peace in coexistence. They were here first, Penelope, he'd argue. The land is big enough. But stories from town told a different tale. Of raids and massacres, of women and children taken. The fear was a constant low hum beneath the surface of daily life. Every distant dust cloud, every unfamiliar sound at night was a potential threat. Her nearest neighbors, the Carters, were a full day's ride away. There was no one to call for help. A sharp cry from the cradle broke her trance. Lily was awake, her tiny face scrunched and red, her mouth opening and closing like a hungry fledgling. "Shh, my love," Penelope whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. She lifted her daughter, the small, warm weight, a comfort against her empty chest. As she unbuttoned her dress to nurse, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Grief was a hunger all its own, devouring everything from the inside out. As Lily latched on, a sudden, violent clap of thunder shook the house so close and so loud it felt as if the sky had split open directly overhead. The heavens, which had been stubbornly, cruelly clear all day, unleashed a torrent. Rain, thick and furious, hammered against the roof and turned the dusty yard into a churning sea of mud. It was a brutal, cleansing storm, as if the world itself were weeping with her. Penelope sank into the rocking chair, Lily cradled in her arms, and watched the lightning flash, illuminating the chaos outside. She closed her eyes, rocking back and forth, the familiar motion a small island of peace in her sea of sorrow. She must have dozed, lulled by the rhythm of the rain and her own exhaustion. She was woken by a different sound, a scraping, dragging noise at the front door. Her eyes flew open, her heart instantly seizing in her chest. It wasn't the wind. It was heavy, deliberate. Someone or something was out there. Her gaze darted to the rifle propped against the wall, the one Thomas had taught her to use. It was loaded. Slowly, carefully, she laid the sleeping Lily back in her cradle. Her own breath was loud in her ears. She picked up the rifle, the cold, heavy steel a terrifying reassurance. She crept to the door, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. Peering through a small crack in the shuttered window, she tried to see through the sheeting rain. What she saw made her blood run cold. It was a man, an Apache warrior. He was on his hands and knees, dragging himself toward her porch. His black hair was plastered to his face, his buckskin clothing torn and soaked dark with a mixture of rain and blood. A deep gash ran across his shoulder, and one leg was bent at an unnatural angle. As she watched, his strength gave out. With a final shuddering groan, he collapsed face down in the mud, just feet from her door. Penelope's mind screamed. Enemy. Raider. Killer. Every horror story she had ever heard coalesced into the form of the man lying in her yard. He could be a scout with a dozen more warriors, hidden in the rocks waiting. She raised the rifle, the stock pressed hard against her shoulder, her eye sighting down the long barrel. Her finger tightened on the trigger. It would be so easy. A solution. Justice for all, the fear for all the whispered threats. One shot, and the danger would be gone. But then, through the deluge, she heard it. A sound almost lost in the storm. A baby's cry. It wasn't Lily. Lily was sleeping soundly. This cry was thin, desperate, and it was coming from the warrior. Penelope's eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of it. And then she saw it. On the man's back, protected from the worst of the rain by a hide flap, was a cradle board. And from within that cradle board, a tiny fist punched the air. The rifle wavered in her hands. A baby. He had a baby. The storm raged. The warrior lay motionless. The unknown infant cried, and Penelope Jenkins, a new mother and a new widow, stood frozen between the instinct to kill and the instinct to save. The choice she made now would not only determine their fates, but would set in motion a current of events so powerful it would carve a new canyon through the landscape of her life. Fear was a cold, hard knot in Penelope's stomach. Her mind raced, presenting a litany of terrifying possibilities. It was a trick, a cruel Apache ruse to gain entry to her home. He would kill her, take her baby, burn the ranch to the ground. The stories the men told in town were filled with such brutal deceptions. Thomas's warnings, once gentle precautions, now echoed in her head as prophetic shouts. Never let them get close, Penelope. Never show weakness. She held the rifle aimed at the motionless form for a full minute, the rain plastering her own hair to her face as she peered through the crack. The man did not move. The only signs of life were the relentless downpour and that weak, persistent wail from the cradle board. It was the crying that broke her. It was a sound she understood on a primal level. A sound that bypassed prejudice and fear. It was the universal language of helpless, desperate need. Her own Lily had made that exact sound just hours ago. Her breasts, still full from nursing, ached in sympathetic response. He's a man, a small voice whispered in her soul. A father. And he's trying to save his child. With a sob that was part terror and part resignation, Penelope lowered the rifle. Thomas was gone. His rules, his protection were gone, with him. She was alone, and the choices were hers to make. She leaned the rifle against the doorframe, took a deep breath that did little to calm her hammering heart, and unlatched the heavy wooden bar. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it back against the interior wall. Rain and wind flooded the small room, extinguishing the lantern on the table and plunging the cabin into near darkness. Ignoring the deluge, she stepped out onto the porch. The mud in the yard was ankle-deep, a thick, greedy mire. The warrior was just a few feet away. Up close, he looked younger than she had first thought, perhaps her own age. His face, though streaked with mud and blood, was etched with lines of excruciating pain. His breathing was shallow, ragged. Her first priority was the baby. She waded into the mud, her nightgown instantly soaked and heavy. She knelt beside the warrior, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unfasten the leather straps of the cradle board. The baby's cries grew louder, more frantic as she worked. Finally, the board came free. She lifted it, her heart lurching. The infant inside was tiny, even smaller than Lily. His dark eyes were squeezed shut, his face a mask of misery. His skin was frighteningly cold to the touch. He was wrapped in soft furs, but they were soaked through. He was starving and freezing to death. Clutching the cradle board to her chest, she scrambled back inside the relative shelter of the house. She placed the cradleboard on the thick bear rug, before the hearth, her mind working with a desperate clarity she hadn't known she possessed. She relit the lantern, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. Then she worked quickly, building up the fire until flames leapt and crackled, casting dancing light on the walls. She turned back to the Apache infant. Gently, she unwrapped him from his wet bindings. He was a boy. His skin was the color of polished copper, his hair a shock of impossibly black silk. A small carved turquoise bead was tied on a leather string around his wrist. He was beautiful, and he was fading. Without a second thought, Penelope scooped him up. His crying had weakened to a series of pathetic, breathless gasps. She sat in the rocking chair, pulled her shawl around them both, and unbuttoned her dress again. For a moment, she hesitated. This was the most intimate act a mother could perform. It was a bond, a sacrament of life reserved for her own child. To share it with the son of an enemy felt like a betrayal on a level she couldn't articulate. A betrayal of Thomas, of her race, of the unspoken rules of this harsh land. But then the baby stirred against her, his cold cheek brushing against her warm skin. His tiny mouth opened, searching instinctively. And in that moment, he was not an Apache. He was not the other. He was simply a baby, dying for want of what she could give. Tears streaming down her face, she guided him to her breast. He was weak, fumbling, but after a moment he latched on. A shudder went through his tiny body. His desperate cries ceased, replaced by the sound of frantic, hungry swallowing. Penelope closed her eyes, a wave of profound emotion washing over her. It was a strange cocktail of fear, sorrow, and a fierce protective tenderness. She was keeping an enemy's son alive. The act itself seemed to solidify her resolve. She had made her choice. Now she had to see it through. Leaving the baby boy now nursing contentedly, wrapped in her shawl on the chair, she turned her attention back to the man outside. She couldn't just leave him in the mud. Whether he lived or died, she couldn't leave him to the elements. It wasn't in her. Summoning a strength born of adrenaline, she grabbed a thick blanket. She went back out into the storm, the wind still howling, and faced the daunting task. The warrior was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She looped the blanket under his arms and pulled. She strained her muscles, screaming in protest, her feet sliding in the slick mud. It was a slow, agonizing process. She dragged him inch by painful inch across the yard and onto the porch, then through the doorway and into the house. His wounded leg left a smear of blood and mud across her floor. She managed to heave him onto the bearskin rug near the fire on the opposite side from where his son lay. The storm finally began to subside, the thunder receding into a distant grumble. The house was a wreck. Mud and water were everywhere. An unconscious bleeding warrior lay by her hearth. An enemy's child was asleep in her rocking chair. Her own daughter was still in her cradle. It was a tableau of impossible surrealism. Penelope felt a hysterical laugh bubble in her chest, but she choked it down. Now was not the time to fall apart. She lit another lantern and began to work. First, she checked on Lily, who had miraculously slept through the entire ordeal. Her small chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Relief, sharp and painful, pierced through Penelope's fog of shock. Next, she tended to the warrior. She cut away the sleeve of his buckskin shirt, her stomach turning at the sight of the wound. It was a deep, ragged gash in his shoulder, likely from a cavalry saber. It was inflamed and oozing, but the cold rain seemed to have slowed the bleeding. His leg was worse. The bone of his lower leg was clearly broken, jutting at a sickening angle beneath the skin. She knew a little about healing. Her mother had been the local midwife and healer in their small Pennsylvania town. Penelope had watched her set bones and stitch wounds. With a grim determination, she gathered her supplies: hot water, clean rags, the carbolic acid Dr. Adams had left, and the small sewing kit Thomas had called her field surgeon's kit. She cleaned the shoulder wound as best she could, the man groaning in his unconscious state. She didn't have the strength or the skill to set the leg bone properly. All she could do was straighten it as gently as possible and bind it tightly between two flat pieces of wood from a broken crate, creating a crude splint. As she worked, her fingers brushed against a small leather pouch at his waist. It felt solid out of place. Curiosity gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. It was not her business. Finally, exhausted to her very bones, she was done. The warrior was cleaned and bandaged. His son was fed and sleeping warmly by the fire. Lily was safe. Penelope collapsed into a chair at her small kitchen table, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving a hollow, trembling weakness in its place. She looked at the scene before her. The sleeping children, their chests rising and falling in unison. The unconscious warrior, his proud, harsh face softened in a state of forced vulnerability. She had defied every convention, every fear. She had brought the enemy into her home, fed his child from her own body, and tended his wounds. She didn't know if he would thank her or kill her when he awoke. She only knew that in the silence of her grief, she had been faced with two dying innocents, and she had chosen life. For now, in the flickering firelight of the ravaged cabin, that was enough. The first light of dawn crept through the window, painting the chaotic interior of the cabin in pale grey strokes. Penelope hadn't slept. She had spent the night in a state of hyper-vigilance, dozing fitfully in the chair, the heavy rifle always within arm's reach. Every creak of the cooling roof, every sigh of the wind sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. Both infants had woken in the night, their cries overlapping. She had nursed Lily first, her own daughter's familiar presence, a comfort. Then, with a sense of surreal domesticity, she had picked up the Apache boy and nursed him as well. He drank with a desperate strength, his small hands clutching at her dress. She had named him in her mind, just for now. Daniel. It was a good, strong name, a biblical name, a name from her world, a small anchor in this sea of strangeness. The warrior had not stirred. His breathing was still shallow, and a fever was setting in his skin, hot to the touch. As the sun rose higher, Penelope knew she couldn't stay huddled in the house. The cow needed milking, the chickens needed feeding. Life, relentless and demanding, went on. She laid both babies together in the large cradle, a startling image of black hair and blonde hair side by side. She gave one last wary look at the warrior, then slipped outside. The world was washed clean. The rain had settled the dust, and the air smelled of wet creosote and earth. The morning was beautiful, its tranquility a stark contrast to the turmoil within her home and her heart. As she worked, her mind was a whirlwind. What had she done? What would she do when he woke up? Would he be grateful, or would he see her as a captor? When she returned to the house with a pail of milk, she found him awake. He had pushed himself up into a sitting position, his back against the hearth. His eyes, dark and intelligent, were fixed on her. They held no gratitude, only a fierce, burning intensity. It was the look of a cornered wolf. His hand rested on the hilt of a knife tucked into his waistband, a knife she hadn't noticed before. Penelope's heart leaped into her throat. She froze in the doorway, the milk pail suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. The fragile peace of the morning shattered. They stared at each other for a long moment, a silent, primal negotiation of power and intent. He was the intruder, the enemy. But he was also wounded, and she was the one with the rifle, the one in control of the food and shelter. His gaze flickered from her to the cradle. He saw the two infants, sleeping peacefully together. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, confusion, disbelief, perhaps something more. Penelope forced herself to move, acting with a calm she did not feel. She walked to the table, set down the milk, and then turned to face him. She kept her hands open and visible, away from the rifle. "Your son was hungry," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "He was cold." The warrior said nothing. He simply watched her, his eyes missing nothing. He did not understand her words, but he understood her tone. Breaking the tense silence, Lily began to fuss in the cradle. Penelope went to her, picking her up and soothing her with soft words. The warrior's eyes followed her every move. When Lily had calmed the other baby, her Daniel began to cry. Without hesitation, Penelope picked him up as well. She held him for a moment, letting the warrior see that his son was safe, warm and dry. She dipped a clean rag into a cup of cooled, boiled water and let the baby suckle the moisture from it. For days, this became their routine. A tense, silent coexistence. Penelope would care for the children and the ranch. The warrior would watch. He refused all food she offered him, accepting only water. He would drink it only after she had taken a sip from the same cup first, his suspicion a palpable presence in the room. He never slept when she was awake. If she moved in the night, his eyes would instantly be open, glinting in the firelight. The fever still held him in its grip, and she knew he was in immense pain from his leg, but he never made a sound of complaint. He was a wall of stoic endurance. Yet slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift. He saw the gentleness with which she handled his son. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face as she cared for two infants, cooked, cleaned, and managed the endless chores of the homestead. He saw that she gave his son the same care she gave her own daughter. There was no difference in her touch, no hesitation in her comfort. One afternoon, as she was changing the dressing on his shoulder, her hands were clumsy with fatigue. She dropped the roll of clean bandages. Before she could bend to pick it up, his hand shot out, not the one near the knife, and caught it, placing it back in her lap. It was the first gesture he had made that was not one of threat or suspicion. Penelope's breath caught. She looked at him, and for the first time the burning hostility in his eyes had been banked, replaced by a grudging curiosity. The real turning point came a week after his arrival. His fever had finally broken, but the gash on his shoulder still looked angry and was healing poorly. Penelope knew it needed to be cleaned more thoroughly. "I have to clean your wound," she said more to herself than to him. "It will heal badly otherwise." She gathered her supplies. As she knelt beside him, he shifted his position. His movement caused the small leather pouch at his waist, the one she had noticed before, to fall to the floor. A small object, wrapped in a piece of doeskin, tumbled out. It was a locket, a silver locket tarnished with age and shaped like a heart. It was clearly not of Apache make. It was something from her world, something a woman in Philadelphia or Boston might wear. The warrior's eyes widened, and he made a move to snatch it back, but his injury made him slow. Before he could reach it, Penelope's curiosity got the better of her. She picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy. Her thumb found the small clasp. "Please," she heard a voice say. The word was raspy, thick with disuse, and spoken with a heavy accent, but it was clear English. Penelope froze her fingers on the clasp. She looked up, stunned. He had spoken. His face was a mask of desperation. "Please, do not." His plea had the opposite effect. Her need to understand, to solve this impossible puzzle, was overwhelming. Her thumb pressed the clasp. The locket sprang open. Inside, protected by a small, curved piece of glass, was a faded tin-type photograph. It was a portrait of a young woman with fair hair piled high on her head and a small, shy smile on her lips. She was wearing a high-collared dress of dark calico. She was beautiful, and she was white. Penelope stared at the image, her world tilting on its axis. Every assumption she had made about this man, about the clear lines between her world and his, was obliterated. An Apache warrior, a man she had presumed to be a raider and a killer, was carrying a locket with a picture of a white woman. Who was she? His captive. A victim of a long-ago raid. Then why carry her picture with such reverence? Penelope looked from the face in the locket to the face of the warrior watching her. His expression was no longer hostile or suspicious. It was one of profound, heart-breaking loss. The same loss she saw in her own reflection every morning. "Who is she, Penelope?" whispered the question hanging in the silent cabin. The warrior held her gaze, and for the first time she saw not an enemy, but a man. A man with a history, a story that was infinitely more complex than she could ever have imagined. The silence between them was no longer one of suspicion, but one of shared, unspoken grief. The warrior watched her, his dark eyes tracing the path of her gaze from the locket back to his face. He seemed to be making a decision, weighing a lifetime of ingrained caution against a sudden, pressing need to be understood. The fever had left him weak, but the look he gave her was lucid and piercing. "Margaret," he said, his voice still a rough, gravelly whisper. He touched his own chest. "My wife." Penelope stared, speechless. The word wife was a stone dropped into the placid pool of her assumptions, sending ripples of confusion through her. "Your wife?" He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His English was halting the words carefully chosen, as if he were retrieving them from a distant memory. She taken, long ago, from a wagon train. I was a young warrior. She was not meant to be mine." He paused, gathering his thoughts, his eyes distant. Penelope sat perfectly still, the locket still open in her palm. The face of the smiling woman, a silent third party to their conversation. "The others," he continued, "they saw a captive. I saw her. Her spirit was strong, not like the others who cried and wasted away. She fought. She learned. She did not break." He looked at Penelope, then a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Like you." The unexpected comparison struck Penelope. She thought of herself digging Thomas's grave, of dragging this man from the mud of her grim determination to simply survive the next day. "We were not supposed to be," he went on. "My people, her people, war. But her heart and my heart, they spoke the same. She chose to stay. She chose me." He looked down at the sleeping infant, his son. She gave him his name, Taza. It means little bird in my tongue. But she also called him Daniel. Your name for him. Penelope's breath hitched. Daniel. She had plucked the name from her own world, and it had, by some impossible coincidence, been his all along. The connection felt fateful, a thread weaving their disparate lives together. My name, the warrior said, bringing her back, is Goyakla. Goyakla. The name meant nothing to her, but he said it with a simple dignity that gave it weight. She was killed, he said flatly, the pain raw in his voice despite his stoic delivery. White men with blue coats, soldiers. They attacked our camp at dawn. For gold they thought we had stolen. There was no gold. His eyes hardened. She was running with Taza. With Daniel. A stray bullet. He touched his own wounded shoulder. I was hit when I reached them. I took our son and I ran. I ran until the horse died. Then I walked. Until I fell in your yard. The story settled in the quiet room, filling the space with the weight of its tragedy. Penelope finally understood. The raid, the flight, the desperation. It was not the act of a savage, but of a grieving husband and father, identical to her own grief. She was a widow, he a widower. They were both left with a child, a living, breathing legacy of a love that had been violently extinguished. She closed the locket gently and held it out to him. I'm sorry, she whispered. The words were inadequate, flimsy things in the face of such sorrow, but they were all she had. My husband, Thomas, he died just before you came. Goyakla took the locket, his fingers closing around it possessively. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw empathy in his eyes. He gave a single slow nod. He understood. In that moment, the chasm between them of race, of culture, of a century of conflict, vanished, bridged by the universal agony of loss. Their fragile peace was destined to be short-lived. The Arizona Territory did not allow for such tranquility. A few days later, a rider approached the ranch. Penelope saw the dust cloud from a distance, and her heart sank. She knew who it was before he was even close enough to recognize. Baron Croft. Croft was a man carved from the same harsh rock as the mountains. He was big and florid, with a booming voice and eyes as small and cold as a pig's. He'd coveted their well since the day they dug it, and he'd viewed Thomas's civility as weakness. He reined in his horse in the yard, his two hired hands a pair of wiry, unpleasant-looking men named Jeb and Abe flanking him. "Mornin', Penelope," Croft boomed, his voice oozing a false sympathy that made her skin crawl. He dismounted his spurs, jingling. "Heard about Thomas. A damn shame. A real shame. Must be hard on you all alone out here." "I'm managing Baron," Penelope said, stepping onto the porch. She kept her body blocking the doorway. Inside, she knew Goyakla would have heard them. He would be silent, listening, waiting. Croft's eyes scanned the property, a predatory gleam in them. "Well, that's the thing, ain't it? A woman can't manage a place like this. It ain't right, and it ain't safe." His eyes narrowed. "Rumor is the Chiricahua are on the move. Cochise's band is restless. Soldiers rode through my land yesterday, tracking a buck who got away from 'em after a skirmish." Penelope's blood went cold. He was talking about Goyakla. As if on cue, a small cry came from inside the house. Not Lily's cry. It was Daniel's. Croft's head snapped up. His eyes locked on the doorway. "What was that thought you only had the one?" "A neighbor's child," Penelope lied, her heart hammering. "I'm watching him." Croft wasn't buying it. He took a step toward the porch. "Since when are the Carters your neighbors?" "They're a day's ride." "Let me see. You're not welcome on my porch, Baron," Penelope said, her voice shaking but firm. Her defiance only fueled his suspicion. He shoved past her, his bulk sending her stumbling. He strode into the dim cabin, his eyes adjusting. And then he saw him. Goyakla was sitting up by the hearth, the splint on his leg, visible, his expression unreadable. Dangerous. Croft stopped dead, his hand flying to the pistol on his hip. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. He turned to Penelope, his eyes alight with malicious triumph. "A neighbor's child, or a savage's spawn." He spat on the floor. "So this is how it is. Husband ain't even cold in the ground, and you're taken up with a redskin murderer." He looked back at Goyakla. "This is the one the army's hunting. The one who killed a white woman they had with them. A captive." "You're wrong," Penelope cried, finding her voice. "She was his wife." "You don't understand." "I understand all I need to," Croft snarled, turning to his men who now stood in the doorway, their rifles ready. "This woman is an Indian lover, a traitor to her own kind. She's been harboring a killer. For all we know, he killed Thomas to get to her. We're going to dispense some frontiers of justice. We'll take care of him, and then this ranch will be under the protection of a man who knows how to handle things." His intent was nakedly clear. He would kill Goyakla, spin a story about saving Penelope from a savage, and use the chaos to seize her land and her water. He was turning her act of compassion into a death warrant for them all. The cabin, once a sanctuary, had just become a trap. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy, charged with the certainty of violence. Baron Croft stood like a bloated lord in the center of the room, his smug grin revealing yellowed teeth. His men, Jeb and Abe, flanked the doorway, their rifles held loosely, but with practiced readiness. They were hounds waiting for the command to attack. "Get the babies out of here, Penelope," Croft ordered, his voice taking on a tone of magnanimous command, as if he were the hero of this drama he had orchestrated. "This is going to get messy. We'll take care of your guest." Penelope's fear was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in her gut. But seeing the predatory look in Croft's eyes, seeing Goyakla cornered and wounded, ignited something else within her, a defiant, furious rage. This was her home. These were the children she had sworn to protect. "No," she said, her voice trembling but clear. She moved to stand between Croft and the hearth, creating a human shield in front of Goyakla. She grabbed the rifle she had left leaning against the wall. "Get out of my house, Baron." Croft laughed, a short barking sound. "Put that down before you hurt yourself. Don't be a fool. You're protecting a savage that would have slit your throat in your sleep." "He's a father protecting his child," Penelope retorted, her grip tightening on the rifle stock. "Which is more than I can say for you." The insult hit its mark. Croft's face darkened, his false bonhomie evaporating. "Have it your way. Jeb Abe. Looks like the squaw lover wants to die with him." Before his men could raise their rifles, Goyakla moved. Despite his splintered leg, he launched himself sideways from his sitting position, grabbing a heavy iron poker from the hearth. With a grunt of pain, he used the wall to heave himself up, balancing precariously on his good leg. He held tall the poker like a war club, his face a mask of fierce, protective fury. He placed himself slightly in front of Penelope, shielding her as she had shielded him. The standoff was absolute. A wounded Apache with a fireplace poker, a lone woman with a rifle against 3 armed men. The first shot came from outside. Abe, the quicker of the two henchmen, fired through the open doorway. The bullet splintered the wooden mantelpiece just above Penelope's head, showering them with dust and splinters. Instinct took over. Penelope dropped to one knee, aimed, and fired back. She wasn't aiming to kill, just to scare. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. It tore through the doorframe, sending Abe diving for cover. "Damn you, woman!" Croft roared, drawing his own pistol. The cabin erupted into a terrifying cacophony of noise. Gunfire, shouting, the babies screaming in their cradle. Goyakla, unable to move quickly, used his position by the hearth as a bastion. When Jeb tried to rush the doorway, Goyakla swung the heavy poker in a vicious arc, catching the man's rifle and sending it clattering into the yard. Jeb yelped and scrambled back, clutching his smarting hands. They were trapped. Croft and his men had them pinned down from the doorway and the single window. Bullets punched through the thin adobe walls, kicking up dust. Penelope and Goyakla huddled behind the thick chimney base, the only solid cover in the house. During a brief, tense lull in the shooting as Croft's men reloaded, Goyakla turned to her. His breathing was ragged from the exertion, his face beaded with sweat. But his eyes were clear and filled with a fire she had never seen before. He looked at her, then at the screaming infants in the cradle just a few feet away. The sight of them, one white, one Apache, huddled together in terror, seemed to focus him. He reached out, and his hand, rough and calloused, briefly touched her arm. His gaze was intense, conveying a message deeper than words could express. "You," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You are his mother. Now." He paused, searching for the right word, the one that carried the weight of his meaning. He looked at his son, then back at her, and spoke a word in his own tongue, a word that sounded like a prayer. "Shima." He touched his own chest, then gestured to her. "Shima, mother." The word hung in the air between them, more powerful than any gunshot. It was not just a label. It was a declaration, a transfer of trust, of responsibility, of love. In that moment of shared peril, he was naming her, anointing her, making her kin in the deepest sense of the word. He was no longer just a warrior fighting alongside a stranger. He was a father entrusting the future of his lineage, his heart, to the woman who had saved his child's life. He was vowing to protect not just his son, but his son's mother. "They will burn us out," Goyakla said, his eyes flicking toward the roof. "We cannot stay." He pointed with the poker toward the back wall of the cabin. "There, behind the stove. The wall is weak. It leads to the arroyo, an escape way. My people use them." Penelope's mind raced. An arroyo. A dry creek bed. She had never known of one so close to the house. "It is our only chance," he insisted. "But they watch the front. I will draw their fire." Penelope understood immediately. A diversion. A suicide mission. He would draw their attention to the front of the house, and she would break through the back with the babies. "No," she cried, shaking her head. "No, Goyakla, I won't leave you." She had lost one man in this house. She would not lose another. "You must," he said, his voice iron. "Shima has to protect the children. It is the way. My son, your daughter, they must live." Before she could argue further, a new terrifying sound reached them, the crackle of fire, and with it, the acrid smell of smoke. Croft was making his move. A burning torch arced through the window, landing on the dry straw mattress of her bed. The flames exploded upwards, instantly consuming the bedding and licking at the dry timber walls. "Now," Goyakla commanded. "Go now." There was no more time for argument. The cabin was rapidly filling with thick, choking smoke. The heat was becoming unbearable. Terror for the children overrode everything else. Tears streaming down her soot-stained face. Penelope scrambled to the cradle. She scooped up both infants, one under each arm. They were crying, their small bodies trembling. "It's all right, my loves. It's all right." She chanted the words, a leaf and a prayer. Goyakla gave her one last look, an entire world of gratitude, regret, and fierce resolution in his eyes. Then he turned away. With a war cry that was pure primal defiance, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the burning house, he charged toward the front door. He burst out into the sunlight, the heavy poker swinging a wounded, magnificent demon emerging from the flames. "He's here!" she heard Croft yell. "Get him!" The gunfire outside intensified all of it, now focused in one direction. It was the opening she needed. Sobbing, she ran to the back wall. Using the butt of her rifle, she smashed at the adobe plaster behind the stove, just as Goyakla had told her. It crumbled easier than she'd expected. Behind it was a framework of old, dry wood. She kicked and battered at it until a small opening appeared. It was just big enough. With one last agonized look back at the doorway, through which Goyakla had disappeared. Penelope shoved the children through the hole, then squeezed through after them. She fell out into the bright, clean air, into the shaded depths of a narrow, sandy arroyo she never knew existed. Behind her, the roar of the fire mingled with the crack of rifles. She didn't look back. Clutching the two babies to her chest, she ran. The arroyo was a secret world, its high sandy banks swallowing the sounds of the firefight. Penelope ran blindly, her lungs burning, stumbling over loose rock, with the precious weight of two infants in her arms. Goyakla's final defiant war cry echoed in her soul. He had called her Shima, Mother. He had named her with his life, and the weight of that sacrifice was a physical agony, as real as the children she clutched to her chest. She ran until her legs collapsed beneath her, finding refuge under an overhanging rock ledge. The sun climbed its heat, a merciless hammer. Despair, bleak and profound, began to settle in when she heard the sound of horses. Her heart seized Croft. She tried to shrink into the shadows to quiet the whimpering children. But the riders who rounded the bend were not white men. They were Apache. A dozen silent warriors, their faces painted for battle. The lead rider, an older man with the regal bearing of a chief, halted his party and dismounted. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, found her instantly. Penelope froze, expecting the worst. The warrior's gaze, however, fell not on her, but on the children. He saw the fair-haired Lily, and beside her the dark-haired Apache boy. A look of astonishment crossed his face. He approached slowly, his hands open in a gesture of peace, and knelt in the sand before her. He pointed to the boy. "Goyakla," he asked, his voice soft with a question that was also a prayer. Penelope could only manage a tearful nod. The man's gaze shifted to her, his eyes filled with a sudden dawning understanding. Shima. The word, the same one Goyakla had used, was a key unlocking her composure. Her sob was the only answer he needed. They had not been a war party hunting an enemy. They were family tracking their own lost kin. They took her with them, not as a captive, but as an honored guest. They gave her water and food, and treated her with a gentle reverence that stunned her. They led her to their rancheria, a hidden camp nestled deep within the Dragoon Mountains. And there, Lying on a pallet of furs, burned and wounded but miraculously alive, was Goyakla. His people had arrived moments after she fled, descending upon Croft's men like vengeful spirits. They had pulled him from the inferno, just as the cabin's roof collapsed. The reunion between father and son was a moment of profound, silent beauty. Goyakla's eyes met Penelope's across the bustling camp, and in their depths she saw a gratitude so immense it needed no words. Penelope and Lily lived among the Chiricahua for 3 months. The world she had once feared revealed itself to be one of complex family ties, humor, and resilience. She was no longer just a white woman. She was the mother, a figure of legend whose story was told in wondering tones around the evening fires. Her bond with Goyakla transformed, deepening, from a connection forged in crisis into one of quiet, steadfast friendship. They spoke of their lost loves and their living children, weaving their 2 disparate worlds together through shared stories and a respect that transcended race. When a fragile, army-brokered peace settled over the territory, the time came for a choice. With Goyakla and a protective escort of his warriors, Penelope returned to the skeleton of her former life. The cabin was a pile of charred timber, but the well remained a promise of renewal. The land was still hers. With the help of her unlikely allies, she rebuilt. The true story of the siege of Croft's greed and Goyakla's sacrifice slowly seeped into the local lore, replacing suspicion with a grudging admiration. Her ranch was no longer an island of isolation, but became a bridge, an unofficial embassy of peace in a land still raw with conflict. Penelope Jenkins never remarried. Her life was not the one she had planned with Thomas, but it was one of profound purpose. Goyakla and his son Daniel were a permanent fixture in it, their appearances a natural rhythm in the seasons of her life. They were a family strange and beautiful, forged in blood, milk, and dust. Lily and Daniel grew up as brother and sister, their very existence a testament to a bond that defied every rule of their time. In the heart of the unforgiving West, a lone woman's act of compassion had not only saved a life, but had redefined her own, proving that motherhood was not merely a matter of birth, but an act of profound and fearless love. Penelope and Goyakla's story is a powerful testament that the deepest chasms of hatred and fear can be bridged by a single act of human compassion. Their journey from presumed enemies to steadfast allies, from grieving strangers to co-parents, reminds us that the bonds of family are not always forged in blood, but in the courageous choices we make in our darkest hours. They teach us that beneath the divisions of culture and conflict, the fundamental truths of love, loss, and the fierce instinct to protect our children are a language we all share. If their story of unlikely hope and resilience moved you, please honor their legacy by hitting that like button, sharing this video with others who need a story of courage, and subscribing for more true-life dramas from the heart of the Wild West. Let us know in the comments below what the word family means to you. Thank you for listening.